Look at this. Blasphemi's back together. The headers still suck, but the roof doesn't. We got fresh paint. No more vinyl wrap for Blasphemi. My buddy Mike Cotton over at Midwest Images hooked it up. She is straighter, she is shinier, and she's no longer rusting. Pretty cool, huh? And she is almost ready for the drag strip. This is one of the infamous Ray Charles welded with his feet headers. Thank you, Big Chief. I'll never live that down. But I have no shame. It was built under duress. We actually had to bash this tube in for the steering to pass through. And then, I taught myself to TIG weld on this car and forgot to clean the inside of all these tubes when it was welded together. So every one of these mandrel bends had oil inside of them when I welded it. And I couldn't figure out, as I'm teaching myself to TIG weld, why am I burning holes in everything I'm welding? And, well, it's because everything was dirty. But today, we're fixing all that. We're building all new headers. I'm going to drop the steering box down to give myself clearance for the shaft there. And by the time we're done, this thing should be back together, working and looking good, the way it should. One issue I had before that I hope to alleviate somewhat right now is the proximity of the steering U-joint to that exhaust port. We've dropped the steering box down, which this is where our exhaust outlet is. This gives us a much better path to have the tube come out and get over the frame rail. Previously, this was about 1.5 inches higher, so this U-joint was right here where the port opened. So this is going to be much better for us. And what we did was we made an adapter out of 1/2 inch thick aluminum plate that bolts to the old bracket on the frame rail there. And if you come around to this side, I'll show you. These are the mounting points for the steering box. It's now lower, but it flexes. And that's no bueno. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a gusset that bolts here and then comes up here to the chassis, and then we'll weld that to the chassis. And it'll triangulate it from here to here and keep this from flexing as the car steers. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to take this piece of tubing, I'm going to weld a washer to it. That will get anchored by the bolt. Then I'll weld our gusset from here up to the chassis. So right now I'm going to use my Miller 280DX to TIG weld the washer to the tubing there. And these pieces are, pretty standard items. That's just a grade 5 washer that I've taken the coating off with a wire wheel. This is some DOM steel tubing. It is 120 thousandths wall thickness. We'll join those together, and that'll be the basis of our new triangulated gusset. This is now bolted through our adapter plate to our steering box, and I'm going to use construction paper to mock up our gusset. That works there. Now all I got to do is cut that out, transfer it to metal, clean the paint off, and then we can start welding. There she is. That is our new gusset. I've got a socket sitting inside the bung. That's to keep the bolt and the bung centered on each other so that after I weld it, I'll be able to get the socket back in there and get the bolt out. The gusset fits tight. I'm going to MIG weld it top to bottom, both sides, and that should help that plate resist the urge to flex. This is it. Everything I need to build a brand new exhaust system for Blasphemi. And in theory, this is everything you need to build something for yourself at home. We've got laser cut flanges. These are beautiful, 3/8 of an inch thick, stainless steel, not likely to warp. We've got mandrel bends made out of 304 stainless steel. We have, quote unquote, mufflers, which there's not much to these things, and kind of looks a lot like a resonator, straight through design. Really not going to do much, but will pass a visual inspection at most drag strips. So I'm going to put these in here because, you know. And then collectors. Now these are a merge style collector, and merge collectors are collectors where all the primary tubes are cut at an angle, and when they come together they form a point or a cone inside of the collector. And that, depending on who you talk to, helps scavenge one cylinder to another, helps promote exhaust flow. You know, this is supposed to be the hot ticket. And I've got a couple of laser cut tabs. These will clamp the collector to the primary tubes. So if I needed to, the collector could slide off. This is it. I'm replacing every bit of exhaust on Blasphemi, and when it's done, it will look cool. And as it heats up, because it's stainless steel, it's going to turn a nice shade of gold. At that point, I'll look at it and go, all right, is that the right shade of gold for the car? If not, yeah, then we'll look into recoating the exhaust like the old pipes. But, yeah, I'm pretty stoked on this. It's going to be a whole lot of work, and I'm ready to get started. There's the old hater pipe next to the new one that I'm about to build. Some subtle differences here. That is a Walker Dynamax bullet style muffler, which is a larger diameter than this one from stainlessheaders.com. The smaller one's going to allow me to tuck the pipe up a little higher than I could with this one. Will it work as well in terms of reducing noise? Who cares? It's a Hemi-powered 55 Chevy Bel Air. Noise is a good thing. And this time around, instead of welding that directly to the collector like the old pipe, I'm going to use a V-band clamp. What is a V-band clamp? Well, it's this nifty thing invented, I think, around the same time as the pyramids. It's two rings, just like that. And these two rings index into each other, and then the clamp seals it all up. Really easy to install and remove. I'm excited about that because it'll make it easier to get the hater pipes off of Blasphemi when I'm at the drag strip, so I can try to run the car with and without them, see if it goes faster or just sounds cooler. Here's a tip for you guys. Obviously, not all tubing is created equal. Even the good stuff, the made in America, US source steel, can be imperfect. This stuff is from stainlessheaders.com. I use their stuff exclusively on my builds because they're not that far from me, the quality is really good, and they take great care of me. These are two bends. These are the exact same bends. And if I measure them in various places on both tubes, the measurements are really similar. But although this is advertised as 2 1/4 inch OD 304 stainless, there are places in this tubing where that isn't true. And that's just, part of manufacturing. It just happens. Even though this is mandrel bent, this isn't perfectly round anymore. It's close, but it's not perfect. And what I've learned, thanks to my calipers, is that if I cut the short side of the tubing as my transition from the collector to my primary tubing, the odds are good that this is going to be undersized and it's going to be a sloppy fit in here. Here's what I mean. This is the piece I cut off of here, okay? Go to put that in there, and it goes in, and it wiggles. Alright, this side is a tight fit. It'll barely even go in there. And it maintains the outside diameter further up the tube and closer to the bend. So if I measure out here, this is 2 inch 260 thousandths. Come up here, this is 2 inch 262 thousandths. On this side of the bend, the short side, it doesn't get to 2¼ inch diameter until way out here. So the problem is if you're trying to make a tight turn out of your collector by shortening this end, and trust me, we're past the radius here, it's straight. This will be undersized, the joint will be sloppy. You can move closer to the radius on this side of the tubing, still maintaining the outside diameter you want and a tight fit. Now why is this important? Well, obviously you don't want stuff flopping around in here, but more importantly, if you have an O2 sensor placed in the collector or downstream of these joints, and these joints are loose, oxygen is going to get introduced into here at idle. At idle, you don't have a lot of exhaust speed. So at idle, your O2 sensor is going to read leaner than the engine's actually running, which is no good, especially if you have EFI. So the goal here is to make that joint as tight as you can, and my recommendation is to cut the long side of a J-bend because you're going to get a tighter fit. This is going to be closer to the advertised outside diameter. Okay? Trust me on this, the Ray Charles headers on Blasphemi, that was one of the big problems I had with them, other than the crappy welds and the dirty tubing I used. These joints were always loose, and so I had a hell of a time tuning the car at idle, chasing it around, going, I don't get it. This thing's running at 15:1 no matter how much fuel I put in it. And then the moment I'd step on the gas and I'd get some exhaust speed through here, the O2 sensor would start reading correctly and I'd have to chase the tune again. So there's your tip. Long side of a J-bend, that's the one you want to cut when you're trying to get a tight fit in a collector. I'm lying on the ground right now under the car, so this view of the cylinder head and exhaust flange is actually upside down. So the exhaust ports on our new Edelbrock heads are raised about 1/4 inch from the factory aluminum Mopar castings I had, which is why these flanges, you can tell, the square openings do not match the roof height of the exhaust port of the cylinder head, which is not a big deal because I need to open up the holes in the flanges anyway to fit our 2 1/8 inch diameter tubing. I'm going to have to open the sides of each port up slightly, but then I'm going to open the top of the port a great deal so that not only does our primary tube fit in there correctly, but also we're going to reveal the entire mouth of that exhaust port of the cylinder head for better airflow. So we're going to mark these real quick and then chuck them up in my old Bridgeport mill and let that do all the work. If you're at home, and obviously, you know, not a lot of people have a mill in their garage, but you can obviously do this with a number of different grinding attachments for a die grinder. So I'll show you how to do it on the mill, but you know, that's not the only way to do it. So here's my notes. This side of the cylinder head needs the most clearancing. This side already has about an 1/8 inch gap between that and the exhaust port. So no reason to open this up any further. This is the side we want to open up, and then it needs to be cut higher. Same goes here. Same goes here. This port is pretty close. It's a good match. So we just need to open up both sides equally. Now, we're going to have to smash our tubing because if I were to set that on there and I were to just trace around that, carve it and fit it in there, there wouldn't be a lot of room or gasket left right there. So we're going to squish the tubing here and then mark the flange and then open up the flange in the mill. Everything fits good. I know it doesn't look good because, again, round tube going into a square hole, but don't worry about that gap because as I weld here in the tight area, everything will get warm. I'll take a ball peen hammer, smack that into the corner, it'll fill in, then I'll be able to weld it, and then it will not leak. Flange is bolted up with the gasket in place. I'm using pieces of 1/4 inch thick rubber to hold each primary tube in there and give it a space between the chassis and that. Yeah, it would be great to have more gap between the tube and the chassis, but not a lot of room here, so 1/4 inch will have to do. Plenty of room around the steering. There are side pipes. They're currently sitting on jack stands because I've got to build the exhaust hangers. Jack stands are covered in Ziploc bags to keep from scratching the pipes, because they are rather nice stainless steel pipes. And you can see how it has to step in and go up to the collector there. For those of you that are wondering why I had to rebuild part of the exhaust for drag week to make the car NHRA legal, well, it was because the old pipes were tucked in further under the car and higher. And I had cut into the outrigger, which is right there extending off the chassis out to the rocker panel. I had cut into that and made a half moon and then plated it. And that's how I was able to tuck the exhaust up there. Well, the problem with that is the NHRA tech inspector didn't like it because, you know, technically the structural integrity of the outrigger wasn't great. And on top of that is where one of the down bars for the roll cage comes down and meets. So I had to replace the outriggers before drag week, and then I had to move the exhaust out here away from them. So now what we've got going on is the car's legal, chassis got certified, but now when you get out of the car, you got to be careful you don't burn your legs on these things. I predict that's going to happen a lot. Probably not to me, but to other unsuspecting people, like Daniel Boshears or my wife. There we are. All 4 tubes in place. Now it's time to weld. Now, cylinder 7 and 5, those tubes, fully welded, already done. And the reason I did that was because once that one's there and that one's there, it would be really, well, pretty much impossible to get in there and finish that joint. So I built this tube first after mounting the collector, took the header off the car, welded it. Then I built this tube, took it off the car, welded it. Now it's time to do these ones. Now this one I'm going to leave in because there's fewer joints. That one I welded all the way around off the car. This one I have access to all the way around. So this can stay on here and this can stay on here. This one here, that joint, not impossible, but slightly difficult to do. So I'm going to take it off the car and weld it while keeping the header in place. Now what enables me to do that is I have a slip connection right here, just like on the other ones. These are 2 1/8 primary tubes. This steps to 2 1/4. Well, the 2 1/4 will slide over the 2 1/8. So what I'm able to do, even though the collector and everything is connected right now, is I take my primary tube out of the cylinder head, shove it up in here, twist it, and it'll come out, and then I can get this tube pulled up out of the collector, and I can weld this whole tube on the bench, leaving just a couple of joints here to do, plus the flange. Quick tip for you guys. This is the W280 torch that came with my Miller Electric Dynasty 280DX welder. It's a TIG machine, has the optional cooling pump. This is a liquid cooled torch, which is really great for when you're welding for hours and hours, like when you're building a set of headers like I am right now. A couple of things I've done. I changed the back cap out on it because it normally comes with a longer one that can hold an entire tungsten rod, you know, the kind that comes out of a package. I put a stubby cap on there, broke the tungsten in half, reinstalled it, changed the cup out to a larger diameter one. I believe this is a number 10, and it's see-through. I don't know if it's Pyrex or what, but it's see-through, which helps when you're in spaces that you have to look kind of behind the cup at where you're welding, and it makes it easier to see the puddle. And the combination of these two things makes it possible to get into really tight spaces between tubes, around engine mounts. You know, you got to get in there, weld the flange of the primary tube. This really helps. You can get these items at a number of different places. I usually get my cups from a guy named Michael Furick. Runs a company called Dog Fab out of North Carolina. We've talked about him on this channel before. The guy's got really good products, but if you can't find him, you can always get this stuff at a bunch of different places. I'll leave a link to his spot in my description of the video. And now, since all the tubes are on there, we can remove the header for the last time back purge it, and weld it. Yay! And then have a beer. 'Cause I'm thirsty. Those pliers are from Strong Hand Tools, and they are a lifesaver because they have round jaws, and they enable me to clamp the header in any position I need on the bench so that I can keep welding. We are nearing the end. It is now time to make the round tube fit the not round hole. I'm going to weld here, and I'm going to weld here, and when the tube is nice and hot, I'm going to use my ball peen hammer and massage that and that into the corner, and then that and that into the cut, and then we'll weld it and we'll be done. Here's the aftermath, folks. Primary tubes are now 100% welded to the flange. Once I applied some heat, I was able to hammer the primary tube over, leaving about a 1/4 inch gap right there, which I was able to fill no problem. To be honest, I can gap the Grand Canyon if necessary, but I'm proud to say that other than the corners of the flanges, there are no big gaps in these headers. Ray Charles is officially out of my racing program. And here is the money shot. Old headers and new headers. The old headers had a lot of flaws. I already told you all about them, but let's reflect for a moment here. Okay, bashed in there to clear the frame rail. Bashed in there to clear the steering. Probably the poorest welds I've ever made in my life. Okay. We'll just hang these on the wall as a memento. New headers. Some of the best welds I've ever made in my life. And these fit the car. No more bashing to clear the steering or the frame rail. And they're bigger tubes. More ponies. That's what I'm saying. It's time to install these bad boys.